Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Chris Beckman. We're going to be doing some threat modeling today, and it's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So we'll get going. This is a photo of me. If you went to my last talk, I put it in here too, but that I found in my family photo album of me on the original IBM PC. And you know, computers, fear them, love them, play MUDs on them. But it was a simpler time. I think what it makes me think of now is, you know, I was on the internet at a very early age, and the consequences were relatively low. You know what I mean? Like, I played around with MUDs, I was on the internet, I used Gopher. If any of you remember Gopher, yeah, we got somebody, yeah. So, and I don't remember running into horrible things. The reality is there are some bad things on the internet now, and so we need to be aware of them, we need to understand it, and that's some of what we'll be doing today. So, again, I'm Chris Beckman. I'm a principal security engineer at a company called Taxbit in Seattle. We're actually based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. We make tax and accounting software that, in particular, understands cryptocurrencies. So it's used by a lot of exchanges and big companies that deal with cryptocurrencies. I've also worked for the last 10 years in startups dedicated to AI and blockchain, which I was involved in the original AI boom, which was around 10 years ago. And there was a hype wave where we were doing machine learning and lots of big data. That all kind of died down. And here we are again. So it all comes back around. I also hold my Juris Doctor from the University of Iowa College of Law. And in particular, I have conducted threat modeling across organizations big and small. So the things we're going to go over today, relatively thin agenda, but that's because we're going to be doing some real threat modeling. First, why do we threat model? Second, what's a threat actor? Third, overview of common methodologies. Fourth, the hybrid threat modeling methodology. And last, we'll wrap it up. So first of all, why do we threat model? And this is less obvious than you might think. And it's not necessarily clear to all organizations that threat modeling is a thing you need to do or that different ways of doing it are useful. So I think it's good to set a basis and say, why would we want to do this in the first place? So it's a proactive process used to identify and evaluate threats. We often start at the end in security. We get a vulnerability. We get a critical SQL vulnerability in a product. We get a pen test report, something already out in production, and then we scramble and we try and fix it and we put all of our efforts into it, and it slows everything down, maybe it causes a breach somewhere, and all of that could have been saved and thought up front what the kinds of risks we might face and prioritized better. And so that's the goal of threat modeling, to get all the way to the beginning, get a group of people together and say, what could happen and where might we want to focus our energies so that we don't have that SQL injection all the way at the end. A threat refers to a harm in a system or organization. And this is what I think clicked for me originally. Think of threat modeling as evil brainstorming. You know, hopefully no one here is truly evil, but in the moment well, I don't know. You know, I don't know your life, but in the moment of threat modeling, you should be thinking as if you were someone who would attack a system and how they might abuse it. So we get to pretend to be evil. Why do we threat model? So SOC 2 and ISO 27001 do require risk management processes, and most companies interpret that as including threat modeling. Risks are actually kind of after threats. We first think of the threats, and then we use those to determine what the risk might be of each of those threats. But in order to get we call it a risk register in SOC 2 and ISO 27001, in order to produce that document, somebody has to think what might happen to our system first. And you know, in the worst case scenario, you have a risk register and they're coming in from outside sources. You know, somebody reported that this would happen or a vulnerability came up. In a proactive organization, you're doing threat modeling to populate those risks ahead of time. Threat modeling helps us create relevant, security controls in an organization. I think this is what most people think threat modeling is for, and maybe only for. So kind of what I just said, like we're trying to get ahead of it and say, well, maybe if everybody had to use MFA across all our systems, then we wouldn't have so much credential stuffing. Like that makes sense, right? We're proactively thinking about it. But there's actually another reason that I personally think is more important, which is that threat modeling socializes the understanding of threats across an organization. If you get in there with engineers and with people on the accounting team and you talk to them and have them come up with the threats that they're going to face, when you get back to design reviews, when you get back to policy creation, you don't have to step in and say, we have these controls, you have to do it this way. That person already saw why you needed to do it that way, and they're much more interested in helping or potentially making those policies in a way that would prevent it in the first place. So that is and this is actually a harder thing to measure also. We can measure how good our controls came out, but in the end, threat modeling to socialize is actually hard to evaluate. I actually heard a really good suggestion, which is when you get done with the end of threat modeling, ask the participants, would you recommend threat modeling to others? And do you foresee that threat modeling would help you see threats in the future? And then see what people think in your organization. So I thought that was a really good way to measure this potentially in the future. Threat modeling is a creative process, and I like this. I think of security as like, and hold your assumptions that you might have about these things, but it's like the art school of the engineering world. Like these are the people who are coming up with the weirdest ideas, the ways that systems were never supposed to be used. That's kind of the whole point. An engineer went and designed it exactly how it's supposed to be, and they just never saw that there was another way in or a different way we could get through it. And so it's a creative process. It's not the kind of structured bullet point thing that a lot of other things in engineering are. Another note I would have, and this is just having run a lot of threat modeling sessions, it's really important to have psychological safety. And what I mean by that is you want a group that believes that they can express their opinions without fear of negative consequences. And that's actually really hard in security. I think people in security like me are known for telling people what to do. You have a vulnerability here. It has to be fixed within this SLA. I've certainly said that in my career. But we need to be able to interact with people in a thoughtful, creative way as well. We need to be able to sit them down and say, this is a moment where we're always all in it together, but we really need to be all in it together right now. We need to come up with these ideas because they will proactively help us in the future. That means allowing for ideas of all plausibility and likelihood. And that may sound wild, like you say I can just throw at anything and it's no big deal. And that kind of is the best case scenario for threat modeling. Because, and their models have slowly changed to allow that. When we first started threat modeling, when it was first kind of invented, a lot of the idea was to really strictly, narrowly fit within categories. And threat modeling methodologies have moved to be more like a brainstorming session where we sort them down at the end. So this is actually from the hybrid threat modeling methodology, which I'm going to get into more in a minute. But counterintuitively, you often get better results from threat modeling when you involve people at the company who are not technical. And I've seen that. They often provide outside understanding of how a business works that engineers sometimes miss. And so it's really tempting when you threat model to say, let's pick the 3 to 5 to 10 people who built this system. They know how it works. Get them in the room and see what they think the threats are. But I've seen where that system integrates with accounting. You bring the accountant in, and that's not how it works. We actually access it completely differently. We bypass all of the things you just said you built, and suddenly everything the people who thought they'd build all these security controls go out the window, and we have a much better session. So I've actually some of the most truly evil suggestions I've ever heard in threat modeling session came from an office manager. So, I think it's great. This can be done by anyone. Many threats themselves are not technical in nature. A significant number of the threats we face are social engineering. People essentially doing scams and tricking each other. We all kind of at a baseline understand, because we have to, understand how scams work. So other people can contribute. I'll also say, I think I included this later, but people who aren't technical or don't know about the system, you don't necessarily need to be the one who is proposing threats, but often they're the ones giving a reality check. So that is very valuable too. So next, what's a threat actor? You may have heard there are bad people on the internet. Different threat actors have different motivations and resources, and that makes a big difference to how they'll attack you and what they might do. Also, most threat actors have malicious intent, but not all. So there are cases where someone may not have any malicious intent versus you, or maybe not at all. I think that's rare. But a threat is a pretty broad thing. We can use our understanding of threat actors to understand more about our threats. And some common include our favorites, the script kiddies. And that would, we do actually throw that around as a term because it's someone who's just copy and pasting, scripts that they found on a vulnerability website or in a Discord, and they're trying it against your organization and seeing what sticks. And they are very different. What they might try is very different than our nation-state actors, who, if you're working at a bank, may be willing to take a year or 2 years to study everything about your organization and find the exact single path in. So if you're doing threat modeling, understanding what threats might be tied to what kind of group really helps ground the discussion. And the hybrid methodology uses that in particular. So, I've got up here things like criminal organizations. I'd say that takes up the majority of attacks, to be honest. There are groups that make a lot of money off of attacks. And I think of them like little tech companies, because they are. They have engineers. In some cases, and this is really sad to me, I've heard that a lot of the big phishing operations employ people who are essentially indentured servants or slaves, which is awful, who don't really have a way out. When I always think of that whenever it's like, oh, I hate that fisher, it's like, the reality is the whole thing is bad. But there's a lot of money to be made here. People are often in countries that are not going to go after them. They feel particularly protected, that they can make a ton of money, and in some cases, they're even encouraged to do so. So that's the criminal organization, but sort of with the backing of a nation state. They know that if they attack certain targets, it's just not a big deal. Perhaps the adversaries of that country. All right, continuing on, various domestic terrorist groups certainly, and that's obviously a loaded word, but various groups that are unhappy with the current, their current political environment are willing to do extreme things. Insider attacks. I always make lots of jokes about this in threat modeling session because it's like, look around at your fellow engineers. What do you think they'll do? And the reality is very uncommon, right? It's not most people are responsible. But we have to account for the fact that there are a small number of people who would do something terrible at their organization. They'll get in deep trouble for it, but the company has to consider that a threat and a risk. Just as an example of that, there's a news article that I kind of keep in my mind. There's just basically someone who was disgruntled at a small company with an AWS account and just deleted everything. Ruined the company. But uncommon, but a real threat. So hired pen tester, I am not joking. If you take a pen tester and you they unintentionally attack a different part of your organization, they don't understand your scope, they take down production, all of a sudden you have a threat actor with no malicious intent. Certainly happens in the real world. Competitor, very rare. I don't think there's a ton of hacking, corporate espionage, but I think it does happen. I think it's uncommon but plausible, and I think there are probably companies that wouldn't mind it falling in their laps. So curiosity-driven hacking, I think this is where a lot of this started. I think if you ever read any of Kevin Mitnick's books, a lot of people on the early internet were just interested in learning about computers, and there wasn't a lot of set understanding of what it meant legally to hack into something. And so, people wound up getting on the wrong side of the law, which wasn't clear to them. And they didn't have any malicious intent. Kevin Mitnick has long said that he was just interested in the source code. He just wanted to learn, I think it was Sun Microsystems, how their source worked. And of course, he wound up going to jail for it. He's now, I think, the chief hacker for KnowBe4, one of the top organizations, so he's doing fine.
He passed.
He passed away? I missed that. Oh, that's really sad. Well, we'll take a moment of silence. Kevin, I've certainly enjoyed his books. He's someone who really understands the social engineering side of all of this. And then, obviously, foreign terrorist group, anarchy groups, so somebody who just wants to see your organization or other organizations burn. I often joke about the DeFi activists, so someone who's in cryptocurrency is really angry about specific parts of cryptocurrencies. There have been attacks against like exchanges and things because someone had very strong views about cryptocurrencies. Exploit developer, so this person is just making a buck. They're making malware and they're hoping that it will get used somewhere. Or they don't care, they just want money. And then someone avoiding the authorities, I actually did put this in because Kevin Mitnick ran from the law, so and used a lot of his knowledge on the way, which is the main part of why he went to jail. So how?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Would you not include APIs and system accounts?
I would not consider that a threat actor. Threat actors are usually human with this idea, but they are certainly part of attacks. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
How do I know what an attack might look like? So I found it useful to just read security news. There's a lot of really good free intelligence feeds and newsletters that are put out, and I've kind of filtered it down over the years. But I read breach reports. I think they're interesting. They're fascinating to see what people really do. But I think that the thing that people really miss are industry-wide reports like those that come from CISA, Verizon Data Breach Report, which Verizon, you know them as your phone carrier. They also run one of the biggest MDR services, which is Managed Detection and Response Services in the Fortune 500. So they put out an annual report on what they see in all of their environments. That's data we can use to know who is attacking what, and that's really useful to ground our threats. CrowdStrike's annual report, that's similar. I mean, they see and run a lot of environments. I think those are really useful for understanding what kind of attacks are likely. But that said, I think all of you, if you're interested in computers at all, or you've even just read the news, probably know enough about some attacks to contribute to threat modeling. We're inundated with it to some degree. When in doubt, think about motivations and threat actors. And just as I said earlier, you do not necessarily have to be the one suggesting ideas. So, threat modeling methodologies. My current manager actually worked at Microsoft in a group that helped create Stride. So I love threat modeling, and my new manager says back, I helped create threat modeling. But Stride was currently, the industry standard, still is. If you go to a big company, you don't want to do threat modeling, Stride is pretty common. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And his comment was, our biggest mistake in making Stride was putting the most interesting parts last. That when you start and you get all the way through spoofing, people are just kind of done by the time you get to denial of service and elevation of privilege. So I thought that was fascinating. Trike is another method which is focused on risk management. And there are different parts of this that get covered in, so they put different parts in it. PASTA, which is an end-to-end methodology, which considers mitigation as part of the process. They don't all, in fact, hybrid really doesn't, talk about how will we fix this. That may or may not be in or out of scope from threat modeling. I usually think of it as out of scope. PNGs, so this stands for persona non grata. This method is entirely attacker-based. So you basically draw up little profiles of who you think might attack your company, and then you use that to generate threats from it, and that's the main process. The security cards, which I love the security cards. This method uses guided cards to help the brainstorming process. And this was actually created at the University of Washington, and you can actually buy the cards at their bookstore, but it's used across companies in the US. Last, I'd say the hybrid methodology, which is what we're here for today, which combines elements of Stride, PNGs, and the security cards. The reason why I like the hybrid methodology is it scales well. So I've done the hybrid methodology in an hour. I've done it in a week. It covers the bases in terms of helping people understand what they're threat modeling, but also giving them room to be creative. But it also provides a nice structured way to get down to a good list at the end. So I found it to be just a good middle ground between all of these. So the hybrid methodology was created at Carnegie Mellon University, and it includes these steps. So this was actually, they released a paper when they first put it out. And it includes identify the system, which looks like, well, we'll get into the details of those, but use the security cards, prune persona non gratas, which you're going to recognize some from other steps. They stole from every other methodology to make one. Summarize the results and conduct a formal risk assessment. And I've included a link to the hybrid threat modeling method, but if you Google that in Carnegie Mellon, you'll find it as well. Okay, so we'll walk through the steps of the hybrid threat modeling method. First, we have to have a shared understanding of the system we're threat modeling. If one person thinks that we're talking about this part of the product, and another person thinks we're talking about the cloud layer, and another person thinks we're talking about IT systems, you just wind up with a lot of chaos. And so it's important to ground everybody at the beginning and say, this is the scope of what we're talking about. We're only talking about this system, or we're only talking about this part of our company. And the hybrid methodologies does this by asking you to have someone in the group who's a system designer and have them share diagrams that were used during the creation of the system, or come up with them if you don't have them, that kind of outline what we're talking about. And it's not specific as to what. So I prefer diagrams, so I prefer a simple diagram that shows kind of what we're talking about. But I've used everything from just Confluence documentation to notes from an engineer. Like, in the end, you just need to get everybody on the same page. That's what this step's about. Next, you use the security cards. The security cards, again, we created at University of Washington, and you can actually use them for non-commercial use. You can reproduce them, and for commercial use, you are supposed to buy them from the bookstore. It seems reasonable to me. And you can get a PDF of all of them from the website. So if you're using them for non-commercial use, you can download them and print them. Basically, they look like a set of cards that has a lot of different ideas on them that might help jog your ideas about how someone might attack someone. So these two that are on here, what kind of inside knowledge might someone have that would help them attack your system? And on the back, I don't have it here, but on the back side of the card, it has a text that helps you think through that idea. And then physical well-being, someone might have physical well-being or need it. How does that impact an attack? And I brought with me some printed out for our educational purposes, since this is definitely nonprofit or not-for-profit cards that we're going to use to look through these. So the next step would be prune PNGs. Once we have collected all the threats, we prune them. The hybrid methodology says that we prune them based upon how realistic it is that an associated persona non grata, aka threat actor, is for our system. And this is actually from the original document for how to make persona non grata. Like, they went all out. They're like, here's the clipboard that shows all the details of the person who's going to attack our system. Well, you don't have to go that in depth, right? We can do a broader brush. We can say, here are the categories of, we all have an understanding of the script kiddie who only has basic knowledge of program. That's usually what I wind up doing. But this looks like, I think the most useful part of this is what we're really asking is, based upon what you're doing, what is in and out, what kind of threats based upon persona non gratas are in and out of scope. So, if I'm hosting a personal blog, I'm probably not going to get a nation state actor to spend a year on me. But if I'm running a cryptocurrency service that's used by every bank to send millions of dollars, yeah, they're gonna. So that's the idea. You're thinking through what kinds of threat actors might attack you and narrowing down the threats based on that. Next, you summarize the results. And I've always just used a Google Doc. There is tooling around, particularly Stride. And if you ever do Stride at work, or you use Stride, I would strongly recommend looking into open source tooling that lets you quickly and easily summarize everything, because Stride gets very complicated. But hybrid methodology is just much simpler. Like, we're just not asked to go into quite as much depth about how it fits into each part. And so it's just as simple to just make a nice Google Doc, walk through all the threats, and then pass that along to the risk process. Which, the next step here, conduct formal risk assessment. So there are endless risk assessment frameworks. Like, if you go into compliance, there are so many. And I don't have a favorite, if that's a question. Like, in the end, you wind up with ones that try to formalize it into a number and ones that don't. Like, that's kind of the two big categories. Are we trying to make like a quantitative result, or are we trying to get a general idea of the risk level? And even that, I feel like the general idea, you just wind up with bands and you kind of still wind up with a number. So at the basic side of risk assessment, which is usually what I do when we're doing sort of shorter sessions like this, it's likelihood versus impact. So how likely is it that this is going to happen? And then how big an impact would it be if it did happen? And you essentially, you take the middle of those, or you times them. There's a couple different ways to do it. But however you formula that, you wind up at the end with a number that says this is the overall risk score. The goal of the risk assessment is to gain an understanding of these two factors. So some pointers for threat modeling from my experience. It's helpful because, we can all say right now, what is a major risk against whatever system I'm going to show you? Phishing. Like, it's true. Like, it's so true against so many different systems. It's a big problem. But I don't think it's super helpful on a threat model to say just phishing. And so I recommend we come up with phishing as one of the risks in our threat model, but what's helpful is to say, this person got phished and that led to this result. So the CEO got phished and it led to access to their email account and the person was able to pretend to be the CEO and that's a problem. Or the DevOps engineer got phished, that got access to their account and they had access to AWS, and that's what happened. You know what I mean? Like, a little more specificity than just the attack. You want to see the whole thing. So the cards, I think, can be a little confusing at first because it's not like a card game. We're not playing a card game with it. We're not passing them around or trading them. They are merely there for you to go through and get ideas. They are just a big set of things that will help spark ideas in your brain. And so when you're stuck and you can't think of another one, you go through it and go, oh, I'm going to think a minute about this one. And the idea is it's supposed to spark your ideas. So be creative. Do not be afraid to say something that may not be possible. There is a step, as we saw before, where we prune. That includes both pruning persona non gratas, but it also includes pruning just really unlikely threats. And there is no shame or harm in having, the extreme would be like, we find alien technology and it lets us hack into all encryption. Like, I don't mind a couple of those. Like, be creative. Try to think outside of the box. We want to have this generally grounded in reality, but there are some pretty wild attacks out there. And if you don't think creatively, you'll miss them. Next, I think I said this, but risk analysis can get very complicated or we can make it very simple, and today we will make it very simple. And then last, you should always have a broad group. So let's threat model. I'm going to have each, we want to get into, I think we have enough for 5 groups, so maybe roughly 5 people if I had to guess per group. Basically, we're going to threat model a system that I've come up with, which I'll show you in a second. Yes. So the model, you're all waiting with bated breath. What we are going to threat model is Han Solo's starting to start a business selling his bounty hunting services over the internet. He has a plan for the following setup and asked us to threat model it. He wants to make a website blog. He's Han Solo. He's not an internet guru. He's not an engineer. He is out doing doing bounties. So he doesn't have like a lot of resources at the moment. We're kind of scrapped, and so he is doing it himself. He's making his website blog hosted on a single instance. So like if you be like a virtual server provider, the website hosts WordPress, and it's installed directly on Debian. WordPress has a number of plugins because again, he's not a master of WordPress. He's a master of bounty hunting. And so he has a contact form plugin. So this is so Jabba can get to him. In the end, if he needs to ask questions. We have an AI content generation plugin. He's a busy man. He's got to be able to generate content for his website quickly. We've got a caching plugin. So this is a plugin that makes his website faster. It's not a super fast instance, and so we're gonna want to make sure it gets loaded up quickly. A commerce plugin connected to a well-known payment platform. So this is a plugin that basically works with a payment platform that's a third-party service he uses. And it's what takes the credit cards and payments, etc., for his bounty hunting services. And think of the plugin as just like a front end for that, so that he can run that through his website. An SEO plugin, not going to sell bounty hunting services, you can't be found on Google. And a drag and drop layout plugin. So there's a plugin that lets you drag and drop, again, he doesn't know CSS. He needs this to look good. So we're dragging and dropping the different parts into place. The instance is controlled through SSH. He found a tutorial on the internet and got that up and running. We're proud of him. But he plans to update the instance through SSH weekly. Busy guy. SSH is secured with a password and nothing else. So this is our system. This is way too small. So but I did create ourselves a nice diagram that shows the various ways that Han the admin gets in and users. But it is truly, given the size of our diagram, it's truly a repeat of this. I think it's going to be more useful to look at the text. So I'm going to leave that up there. And can we divide into groups? It's okay to just kind of do people around you. Any interesting threats that people came up with?
Reputation attacks from competitors in the market.
Yeah,
going after jobs.
Okay, so
or knocking down his reputation.
Yeah, and using the website as a way to attack.
Yeah,
like if we knew where he was going, we can get to the bounty first.
Yeah. And
deny him that gain.
Yeah.
Or warn the person that was being targeted.
Yeah.
And
blackmail them. Yeah.
Or posting nonsense, so that he looks like a fool.
So I like that. Let's say competitors injecting nonsense contacts into the form, because you might not think of that. Like he might be assuming that
or nonsense posts.
Or nonsense posts
that look like it's coming from him, making him look
posts. Yeah, no, that's
irresponsible.
That's a good one. And what else we got?
A former captured person from a bounty that hacks in, creates a fake profile to bait him into a trap.
Okay. Okay, I like it. What else we got?
Vendetta, basically.
Vendetta. Okay. What else we got?
So one thing we came up with was database manipulation on the clients, like changing the client information within the database.
Information on clients within the database. That makes sense. So, it might be a competitor or just someone who doesn't like him. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. What else we got? Yeah.
Scanning through the plugins to see what
plugins
are being used and what versions they're at and how often he updates them, and sneak in between weekly updates.
So yeah, he's only doing weekly updates. These are very complex plugins. I'll just say from my experience, first of all, something that might horrify you all, this is not as unrealistic as it sounds. Like getting rid of Han Solo, there are a lot of WordPress sites out there with every plugin not really that updated, with a lot of vulnerabilities, and that would be a major concern. They're not updated, maybe there are vulnerabilities in the plugins, and there's scanning tools to find them for vulnerabilities.
And it sounds like there's a lack of things like TLS.
So lack of security measures, like TLS means attackers could find out data over the wire. Also make them look really bad, because who doesn't have TLS in these days?
Right?
What else?
You could, you have their contact, you could assume, someone could assume the identity and phish one of the clients and, surreptitiously order hits on people without having their identity compromised.
Okay, so assuming the identity of someone ordering,
Right,
ordering
prompt injection or
contracts.
something, get their contacts, and then poses a client.
Yeah. Anything else? What else we got?
I was thinking about the adjustment of threat level of a particular actor. Somebody who's curious will typically have a very low level of determination, but when they see something that's low-hanging fruit, like an SSH password, which, again, like if it's Han Solo, who knows, maybe he's using 8-digit.
Yeah. So SSH might be terrible. And so, were you thinking they'd guess it?
Well, it would cost them very little to set something up.
Brute
and just
force.
pound on it, but
Yeah.
as soon as they get in, they go from a potentially a curiosity threat actor to a malicious threat actor, because if they see valuable information, they could sell that, blackmail, whatever. They could see there's a lot to be gained here.
I overheard so many good things during this session, and one of them was you all talking about that you could brute force it, because that is so true on SSH. SSH, on a default setup with just passwords, you can hit it over and over and over and over again. If you have long enough, you could find almost any password. I mean, we're talking a long time, but there's tools for stopping that, but it doesn't come out of the box. Yes.
Also, the WordPress admin panel usually by default is accessible over the internet.
Accessible over the internet. So what are we doing with that?
So you can brute force that too.
The internet brute force it. And I would say in both of these, there's something called, did anybody use the words credential stuffing? So similar to brute forcing, the idea of credential stuffing is kind of a form of brute force. But there's all been data breaches with people's passwords on the internet. We all know that. Well, there are threat actors who will gather those databases and then slowly try all of them over every other service on the internet. When you're told don't reuse your passwords, that's why.
Yeah.
Because people are slowly trying everything they lost. You may not know that you put your name in X service and it was breached 2 years ago, but you might have used the same password somewhere else and they lost your password. 2 years later, suddenly you're breached, you don't know why. That's a form of brute forcing. So both of these you could both brute force them and or credential stuff. Okay, what else we got?
He tries to pretend he's cool-headed, but he's open to emotional manipulation, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah. However you want to go about that. But
So
he's a lonely single guy.
There is a scam, the name of which I can't say at this kind of conference, that is where people are basically emotionally manipulated into thinking that they're in a relationship and then taken for a lot of money at the end. So I won't say that's, but social engineered to have relationship with Han Solo. I like it. And then convince him to give all money. You know, I mean, like, it happens. It's a real thing.
Sounds like marriage, but.
Now. What else we got?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
We'll do one at a time here. Yeah, go for it. What was yours?
A way to manipulate the commerce system.
Yes.
To either hack into the payment system and route money somewhere else, or just make it so that he thinks he's taking payments and it's getting set to like a fraction of what it's supposed to be.
I think like the private key could be just randomly accessible on the server potentially.
Yeah, so misconfigurations are a major part of security.
Yeah.
Like, I'm assuming, it's actually a really good assumption that Han Solo, following his first ever tutorial to set up a word page site, might have made a few mistakes when he configured those plugins, such as exposing the private key. What was the...
Actually, I was about to do the credit card thing, but
yeah.
we were also thinking about client as a threat.
the client as a threat. So that makes sense.
Setting up the whole transaction, you can go so many different ways on that.
Yeah. So I would say again maybe social engineered by client during negotiation. That makes sense to me.
If you could manipulate the cache to redirect.
The caching layer?
Redirect the caching layer serving a copy of the site, you could manipulate that.
So there are such things as caching layer vulnerabilities, where essentially you can trick the page into showing caches that you didn't mean to. And they're often hard to exploit because you like, it's tough to get it at the right thing that wasn't what you wanted, but it is possible to manipulate content through caching. So that's a great one.
I was going to say, you could potentially get the cache to show you something that was cached for another reason. That the cache may not have like a certain security check in there to make sure you're not supposed to be accessing a certain part of the cache.
Yeah, so vulnerability, I'm going to say vulnerability or information disclosure. Those kind of go together. I like that. Any more? Keep going.
So it generates this content by AI.
Yes.
So you can manipulate it. If somebody could manipulate AI to put in bogus content in his website or his blog or whatever.
Yeah. It's a potential supply chain vulnerability that you're taking in content from another service, OpenAI. There's a couple ways that might go. It could be there are new attacks where it might be relying on data and be able to be, it's called prompt injection. Mm-hmm. Another possibility would be that, just through use of this AI, he becomes kind of, it hallucinates, he doesn't know what it's doing. But yeah, there's a lot of potential for the AI, AI plugin.
We were scoring that kind of as denial of service that you throw in so much data that he doesn't know which ones are real.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think
opportunities or not.
Competitors DDoSing this site is a real a problem. Yeah. So competitors DDoSing any of the site, contact form, payment form, etc. I mean, I think it's kind of an obvious win if you're a competitor to him. It's sort of semi-lawful, lawless man anyway. Yeah. And availability is a major part of what we say, the CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I always say people always forget the A. Like they always forget the availability. Because we want to make confidential systems, we want to make integrity systems, but we never think about the fact that it needs to still be up. Yeah.
This actually happened to me at a large company. There was a vulnerability in a product that we hosted, and it was ScriptKey that just injected a crypto miner, and it was crypto mining took 12 hours for our scanners to catch it.
Yeah, so vulnerability in plugin or WordPress leads to crypto miner. I mean,
or SSH.
Any computing resource theft.
Or any computing resource theft. I mean, that is a really common thing that happens to companies. Yeah, what's up?
This is a standalone system, right?
Yes.
Is it running Linux?
Yes.
So how about the OS? Since you're only patching once a week.
Yeah.
You have a buffer overrun for single access.
Absolutely. So we haven't talked about that it's Linux OS vulnerability. There are lots of major vulnerabilities that come out all the time. One of the difficulties for dedicated system admins like Han Solo is that it's hard to keep track of all of it. And I know people who said when Log4j happened that how did I know that this was the one that was going to cause real exploits across lots of systems? It looked like all the other ones that came out for various systems. And the same thing could happen for Linux. So major zero-day Linux OS vulnerability leads to access to root system.
Isn't that escalation of privileges?
Mm-hmm. So escalation of privileges would look like someone is able to get, let's say, a minor user or a vulnerability leads to. This is actually another thing that happens oftentimes when you have a vulnerability in a software application, you wind up, if you are attacking that system, you wind up as the same user that was that the application was running as.
So you're running something as a root.
Yeah, so they might have been running it as root. I mean, this is Han Solo.
If Han Solo doesn't have access in his account, someone can get his SSH.
Yeah. But what that means is you wind up with multiple stages sometimes, where if he did the right thing and they got in a vulnerability as WordPress, you'd wind up as the WordPress user, which is really annoying because you don't have a full shell, you've got a reverse shell running, but you can't, you can't actually do the commands you want because you're not root. But then you'll look for other vulnerabilities one step further in the system that maybe will let you escalate from the WordPress user to root. So,
and one of the things you could do is, I mean, if you had that and you did use something like, ACLs, put ACLs to allow only certain folks to run it, if they were able to get in there, break out of that executable, now they're that user.
Yeah, yep. So I think, let me ask one more question. Did anybody say anything totally wild? Like, did you hear it? Because I feel like I swear I heard GDPR in the reference. Because I'm very proud of you. Because, I mean, he should be complying with if he's running a website that it could potentially have people coming from Europe. That's an honest threat. You might have GDPR non-compliance. So anyway, that's the weirdest thing I heard, and I really loved it. Thank you. So, all right.
But it's Europe.
We're not going to go through the whole next steps, but other things that I often do in these processes is to basically look through and mark PNGs that are likely for each, just because it lets you think about what kind of threat it is. Write down a potential impact, and then at the end, I have a checkbox in each, and you just prune ones that are unlikely for your system. And I just have it set so that you still keep it, but it marks it red so we know this is maybe a little out of scope for what we want to try and mitigate from this threat modeling session. Yeah, what's up?
Just a question. What was the worst thing or the widest thing you've heard while doing threat modeling session?
I think I once suggested hacking satellites, which is a real thing, but not particularly plausible for most SaaS companies. So that was weird. You hear, a good threat modeling session should have some kind of out there stuff. And then, last, you do a risk assessment, which just basically looks like, injecting nonsense contacts into the form or into posts. So it seems kind of likely-ish, like it's more likely than some things, maybe a 5. And then you would say, what's the damage? Well, he's probably going to pick up on it. It's not like it's going to take down the whole system. Maybe it's a 3, and then you get in the middle there and you give an overall number, and you go through each and try and figure that out. And that would help you give a prioritization of each one of these risks. So I'm going to call it a little early, but if any of you have any questions at this point.
This is fun.
Yeah.
I had actually a little problem with the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
So,
absolutely.
To me, you started at step 2 or 3 here.
Okay.
If you're doing a threat modeling, you're talking about who and what's the threat. Now, if you're talking about, say, Han Solo, what are the things that could hurt Han Solo as a thing? And then when you're doing a threat modeling, is how can you get to do the things that could hurt Han Solo?
Yeah.
The description would be after you say what's going to affect that person.
Yeah, there are different threat modeling methodologies. And many of them do have you list out what are called resources. And the resources are things like, what do you have that someone might want to go after, or what are you vulnerable about? And that is a feature of some other methodologies. I think, from my perspective, I see it as, I hope that you're thinking about those things when you're coming up with threats. Like, that is an important part of the process. But that I think that having a lean process where people can kind of jump in and come up with ideas kind of gets things out of people quicker. But it's just, there are different options. This is not the only threat modeling methodology out there.
I thought the cards actually helped with
Good,
that.
yeah, you like the cards.
They would suggest,
yeah,
what could somebody do for some specific thing.
Yeah, I really like the cards. I think they help, if you've got a group that, it kind of doesn't get going or you don't know what to do, you can always look at the cards and they kind of give you suggestions but aren't too leading. So I like them. Yeah.
I definitely like that idea of taking liabilities, like a lawsuit for not being GDPR compliant, as a threat.
Yeah.
Because that's absolutely true, and it's not like your typical threat, and it's not a malicious actor. It's that you missed something, and that is a threat to your business because now you're going to have a legal repercussion.
We try, and by the way, I have included the company's lawyer in these sessions before, and it's interesting what you come up with. But we do try and think broadly. That is an appropriate thing on your risk register. And in fact, there is compliance standards where if you don't include some of the risks that you got from legal, you'd actually be dinged in your compliance report because you were given this report and you never put it in your risk register. So, absolutely.
There are people where their profit, they make money by catching people missing things like that.
Yeah.
Like not having a takedown address if you have public comments.
Compliance is its own interesting world.
Or the digital, Millennium Digital Rights Act.
Yeah, yep, for sure.
And so they'll find someone, like some unlucky florist that has a comment section, and they'll post something that's copyrighted.
Yeah.
And then
assume
that they don't have
millennial.
and then assume that they don't have a takedown
That's
address.
too bad, yeah.
I like the idea of just kind of throwing out everything, you get everybody talking. But even the really outlandish kind of ideas, even if, there might be parallels with stuff that is realistic.
Yes.
Even if it's totally crazy.
Absolutely.
It matches up, it parallels something else that is serious.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not kidding on the satellite thing. I went to a talk from somebody in the Space Force who talked about how hard it is to update satellites and how small the memory is on them and how little time you have to do it and how old the access controls are on it. Like, it's unlikely to be for our particular threat model, but it's a real threat. So
Yeah.
sometimes weird things get ideas flowing. Okay, thank you so much. That was fun.